Hello and welcome to Single-Use Plastics and the Pandemic. My name is Chandler Randall and I am the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute. I am so delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through Zoom's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send in your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar. And while they will be introduced briefly, their full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. But as we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's moderator and today's panel. Martin Bork is a renowned recycling industry expert who has led the Berkeley Ecology Center since 2000. Under his leadership, the Ecology Center operates the nation's first and longest running curbside recycling program and pioneers zero waste policy solutions at the local level. Nicole Bothwell is an associate in the environmental safety and health practice at Squire Patton Boggs. Nicole's practice focuses on environmental compliance matters. She has experience with numerous federal environmental statutes, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, as well as various other state and federal regulations. Nick Malos is Senior Director of the Trash Free Seas program at Ocean Conservancy. Nick oversees Ocean Conservancy's work on marine debris, which includes the annual International Coastal Cleanup, its International Plastics Initiative, and the Trash Free Seas Alliance, a cooperative group of businesses, conservationists, and scientists focused on reducing plastic inputs into the ocean by 50% by 2025. And Rachel Maidal. She is a fellow in energy and environment at Rice University's Baker Institute. She was previously appointed Deputy Associate Administrator for the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, an agency of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Prior to her public service, Maidal was the Director of Regulatory and Technical Affairs at the American Chemistry Council in Washington, D.C., where she advanced a broad range of regulatory and policy issues. Thank you all so much. And with that, I will turn things over to our moderator, Martin Bork. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you today on such a timely and important issue. The Ecology Center is a 50-year-old nonprofit organization, community-based, started in the run-up to the first Earth Day. And since our beginnings, we've worked on local issues that have global impact or relevance. And one of the very first programs that was started by community members in and around the Ecology Center was a curbside recycling program, and it was the first in the nation. And it came out of Earth Day in the early days of the environmental movement in the early 1970s. At that time, Nixon was president, and under President Nixon, with tremendous pressure from residents across the globe and across the country, it passed the Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and probably 100 other really important pieces of legislation. And we're celebrating our 50th anniversary at a time when all of those things have been under severe attack for the last 4 years, certainly, and really since Ronald Reagan became president. And so, you know, it's sort of in that context that we start to think about this plastics movement and what I would call the fastest moving and most successful environmental movement that I've been a part of in my career. Certainly has come to public awareness and seen so much dramatic action to try and clean up a global problem. And with limited success to date, I would say, you know, the problem is growing, not shrinking, as we'll hear today. But in terms of people understanding what the problem is and how we can begin to address it, it's moved much faster than anything that I've worked on, as I said. We have the amazing panel today that will cover some of the ins and outs of different aspects of that. But within the context, of this sort of mass movement on multiple levels, we've got environmental organizations really highlighting the issue, pressuring for change, providing solutions. We've got everybody through the production chain paying much more attention to the issue and the problems that have been created by the use of plastic, particularly plastic packaging and disposable plastics. And people looking at it from all different angles. And so there's, we'll hear about marine plastic today, but we'll also cover health impacts and, environmental degradation, ecosystem impacts. There's just a whole range of environmental problems that have come up and become, particularly acute. It started maybe a decade ago with some awareness that there was this plastic gyre, a floating mass or an island of plastic turned out to be a big stew of plastic in the middle of the ocean. In the Pacific was the first one that was really documented first, but now we know that they're in all the major oceans and really major waterways and bodies. And now we see, the focus then shifted to, oh, well, where's it coming from? And the focus was on Asian countries, and basically the narrative said, oh, these countries don't clean up their own mess. And then we found out, hey, guess what? We're exporting millions of tons of plastic to these countries through recycling programs. And some of that is getting recycled and much of it is getting dumped or burned in and contributing to those problems in other countries. And then finally it was like, well, who owns this stuff? Where's it coming from? And it comes back to a number of major brands that we can really identify by the labeling, whether it's bottlers or other fast food snack packagers or others. And so that's led us to a place where we can really now start to say, well, what are the solutions? And earlier this year in February, Senator Udall and Representative Lowenthal introduced the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And it was a sweeping, comprehensive, integrated approach to reducing plastic and plastic pollution. So it covered plastic bag bans and a national bottle deposit system and holding companies responsible for their waste and investment in recycling systems and a moratorium on new plastic packaging infrastructure in the petrochemical industry. So just a broad and sweeping approach. And now many of those ideas that were put together in that initial legislation are being considered at the state level as well. So, it's in the 30 years that I've been involved in recycling, I haven't seen anything like this that addresses sort of the full spectrum of any material, much less plastic and the fossil fuel industry introduced into legislation. So going, sort of from 0 to 60, we've really seen a lot of movement. Shortly after that was introduced, the pandemic hit and the restrictions on people's movement and the stay-at-home orders and mask use and PPE use skyrocketed. And as recycler, we had just passed in Berkeley the nation's first single-use disposable foodware and litter reduction act. It's a policy at the local level designed to reduce plastic foodware which was clogging up our recycling system and had no markets or destination. And we had been working on cleaning up recycling, not just locally, but through nationally, recyclers facing market collapses and rejection of export recycling to Asia, China, and other Asian countries. I've been really trying to clean up recycling, which had gotten very dirty, and just, you know, with this idea that just throw everything in the blue bin and we'll take care of it from here. And, you know, it wasn't really being taken care of. And so really trying to clean those streams up so that they could be better recycled here in the US. And the pandemic really put the brakes on both of those efforts, or really set both of those efforts back. And we'll hear a little bit about the impacts of that on the environment. But many efforts to reduce single-use disposable plastics were put on hold by the pandemic. So states that had plastic bag bans put those bans on hold. So here in California, we have a bag reduction, a disposable bag reduction ordinance. It banned single-use disposable bags and required paper bags to be, you have to pay for them. And so the goal overall was to reduce the number of single-use carryout bags. And that order was put on hold. And the message came out from the plastics industry that plastics were safer than other materials, and that we needed more plastic in order to keep ourselves safe from the pandemic. And this has largely been debunked, and many people feel it was a very opportunistic and egregious move to try and sell more plastic packaging. At the same time, you know, the PPE really ramped up. So screens, masks, gloves, what do you call them? Aprons, all of that stuff. None of it recyclable. Most of it, I would say, being handled properly, but a good portion of it ending up in our streets, in our creeks, in our rivers, in our oceans. And we'll hear a little bit more about that today. So, you know, as the vaccine comes out, and hopefully, you know, we have a shift in the direction and seeing maybe some light at the end of the tunnel. At the same time, things getting much, much worse across the country through the holidays. You know, where is this all going to go? Because, you know, on the one hand, we have this major movement and pressure to try and address plastic pollution. And then on the other side, we have a resurgence in the use of disposables. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker. And I believe, help me out here, is that Rachel's coming up first?
It's
We have
me.
Nicole Bothwell first.
Sorry, Nicole. I got confused at the last second here. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Martin. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen here. Okay. I'm Nicole Bothwell. I'm an associate at Squire Patton Boggs, and I work in our Cleveland office. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal landscape for plastics use, disposal, and recycling. And there's a lot to cover there, but I'm going to try to go over how plastics issues are currently regulated in the United States, some pending bills, emerging trends, and the impact of the pandemic, as well as the outlook for plastics issues going forward. So currently, plastics issues are primarily governed by state and local laws and regulations rather than federal law. However, there are a few federal laws that do implicate plastics issues. For example, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, which is administered by the EPA, includes some language about resource conservation and recovery, although it's primarily directed at solid waste disposal and hazardous waste management. But it is interesting to note that the EPA cited to RCRA in its recently proposed draft national recycling strategy, which is something I'll cover a little bit more later on. And another thing to keep in mind is that the FDA regulates indirect food additives and sets purity standards for food contact articles. So this can be implicated if manufacturers are going to be increasingly required to include recycled material in their packaging, and will have to meet these purity standards, which can be more of a concern using recycled material, which comes with contamination issues. So as I said, most of the regulation of plastics issues does not come at a federal level. It comes at a state level. And the state laws can kind of be divided into two categories. The laws that are aimed at reducing the use of disposable plastic products, and laws that are aimed at increasing recycling of these products. So I've included some examples of the laws that are aimed at reducing use of disposable plastic products. As Martin mentioned, there's really a lot of increasing movement towards these type of laws at a state level. Many of them are aimed at things like single-use plastic straws, plastic stirrers, plastic carryout bags, plastic packaging of that sort. Very recently, California passed a law prohibiting hotels from providing toiletries in small plastic bottles. So that's something we might expect to see other states follow in that path. And one thing that I think is important to pay attention to with these state laws is the fact that each state defines how broadly or how narrowly these laws apply differently. So it's important to look at the definitions. For example, Maine, which is this MRS definition I have up here, they consider food establishments to include food manufacturers and processors, as well as places like restaurants and grocery stores. So that's a very broad application, whereas other states like New York only apply their laws to grocery stores, restaurants, kind of what you would expect more as a food service provider. And a lot of states will treat facilities such as nursing homes or hospitals very differently too. So that's something to pay attention to when determining the scope of these laws. And the second category of laws that I mentioned, those that are aimed at increasing recycling of plastic products, those are largely known as bottle bills. And those are the programs whereby when you buy a beverage, you pay a deposit, and then if you bring the empty container back to a redemption center, you get your deposit back. Those have been around for quite a while. As Martin mentioned, there's a piece of legislation that would impose a national bottle bill program. Right now, only about 10 states have those bottle bills in place, and they all apply a little bit differently. So a national bottle bill would provide kind of some clarity and stability as far as how manufacturers should comply with those requirements. So one thing that we're seeing as kind of a trend in state law is an increasing focus on recycled content mandates. And this seems to go hand in hand with the increasing awareness of the fact that a lot of these recyclable plastics are not actually being recycled at a very high rate. I think that for a long time, I know myself included, I thought that if I was putting my plastics into the recycle bin, if I was rinsing them out, everything was good. They were getting recycled, and it was kind of a low impact option. But come to find out, actually, the majority of plastic products are not being recycled. I believe in 2018, EPA reported that only 30% of PET plastic was being recycled. And that's one of the most recyclable plastics out there. There's a lot of infrastructure for recycling that type of plastic. And the majority of it is not actually being recycled. So one way to address that is by mandating minimum recycled content requirements for plastic packaging. California recently passed a law mandating minimum recycled content requirements for plastic beverage containers. That's a tiered program, as you can see. So starting in 2022, beverage containers will be required to contain 15% required material, or I'm sorry, recycled material, and that's gonna increase up to 50% by 2030. Similar bills are pending in New Jersey and New York. There was a similar bill pending in Maine that didn't go anywhere. It's interesting to note that a similar bill was passed by both houses of the Washington state legislature, but it was vetoed by the governor in April, and he specifically cited budgetary restrictions caused by the pandemic. So that's something we might expect to see resurface once some of the impact of the pandemic passes. So on a federal level, there has been a lot of movement and action towards legislation to address the plastic pollution problem. The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act that was mentioned was introduced this year, would impose a nationwide container deposit system, would extend producer responsibility nationwide for packaging. So that is bringing up the extended producer responsibility principle, which is kind of one of those buzzwords right now. It's being talked about a lot. And the idea there is to shift the burden back onto manufacturers and require them to take responsibility for their products through the entire life cycle of the products to ensure that the product is recycled or disposed of responsibly. The bill would target expanded polystyrene food packaging, styrofoam, single-use plastic bags, and similar items. The Recycle Act that was introduced last year, that's really focused on increasing awareness and education. It would authorize EPA to develop some guidelines to increase participation in recycling and reduce contamination. And I previously mentioned EPA's draft national recycling strategy that was introduced in October of this year. And the agency set forth some goals, reducing contamination, increasing recycling efficiency, and improving markets for recycled feedstock. This document is largely preliminary. It talks about improving understanding, stakeholder meetings, and feedback, but there's not a lot in the way of specific proposals, certainly no proposed regulations. So that's something to watch as it develops. And that strategy does note the impact of the pandemic on the composition of recycled materials. It acknowledges that there's been less office waste, so less paper, and more plastic waste, PPE, and plastic packaging that's been a result of the pandemic. So finally, the outlook for 2021. We certainly expect to see continued action and movement behind this plastics pollution issue. There have been just recently a number of actions proposed by a group of environmental organizations called the Presidential Plastics Action Plan. They proposed 8 categories of action. One thing that's interesting is that the group specifically stated that these are actions that can be taken via executive action alone and don't require congressional approval. So that could be a trend as well, kind of a push towards approaches to addressing plastic pollution other than legislation, as a lot of those measures haven't gotten very far. The US Plastics Pact, that was a recently formed coalition that includes both environmental organizations and members of the industry. They've set some very ambitious targets, again, looking at increasing the recycled content for plastic packaging. So it's going to be really interesting to watch and see what develops over 2021 and where things stand once the impact of the pandemic hopefully passes by a little bit. So with that, I think I'm over my time and I'm going to pass it along to my next panelist.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicole. I will go ahead and share my screen. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. As Martin said, I'm Nick Mallis. I'm the Senior Director of the Trash Free Seas program at Ocean Conservancy. And Ocean Conservancy is an organization, we are approaching our 50th anniversary next year, working on a variety of issues focused on ocean conservation and protecting our ocean from our greatest challenges today. So I have had the great misfortune to work on plastic pollution in our oceans for the last decade at Ocean Conservancy, but we do a variety of other work on things like Arctic, oil and gas, ocean planning, ocean acidification, sustainable fisheries, and the list goes on. So the ocean really is our client, and we have been advocating for national level policies for almost 5 decades. But today my colleagues are obviously the legal experts here, and I appreciate having their deep dive on many of the relevant policies and pieces of legislation that are out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ocean environmental context. What do we actually know right now about plastics, PPE, the pandemic, and what does that actually look like moving forward for the health of our ocean, as well as how does this fit into the broader context of the issue of plastics that Martin had touched on at the start. So when we think about the pandemic and personal protective equipment, we know that the scale of this material is huge. Scientists have estimated that about 200 billion, that's billion with a B, items of PPE are being used monthly during the global pandemic. And sadly, obviously, first and foremost, human health is of paramount concern during this unprecedented time. But we do know that almost all of that PPE is largely unrecyclable. It is made of plastic, and for a variety of reasons, including the human health, virus exposures, we know it is not recyclable. And what's even more concerning or something for us to seriously think about is the future projections of PPE growth around the world is quite extraordinary. We're going to see massive growth over the next 5 years with unprecedented consumption and use of PPE. So this portion of the waste stream that has been generated as a result of the pandemic is not going away. And obviously, as I said, PPE provides a critical service for protecting humans against the virus. But we do know that it is finding its way into the environment. We know that not all of that 200 billion count, even a small fraction of that, if it finds its way into the environment, that is a very large number. And here I live in Portland, Oregon, which for the most part is a relatively clean area. And it's been astounding for me, as I am sure for most of you, wherever you live around the world over the last few months, just in my everyday walks on trails, down the street, like the evidence more and more of seeing masks and occasional gloves littering the sidewalk, littering the street. And so we do know that this is not being properly managed, and that we are seeing a fraction of this waste stream escaping into our environment. And at Ocean Conservancy, our annual International Coastal Cleanup this year, while data are very, very preliminary, really underscores this. So in more than 90 countries around the world, very, very preliminary data. Again, we are still amassing this, and we expect this number, unfortunately, to be much larger. But we've already seen more than 70,000 items of PPE being documented on beaches and waterways around the world. And again, this is very preliminary data. And so we are seeing firsthand the downstream effects of this fraction of the waste stream as a result of the pandemic. When it comes to environmental risk and threat, we do know that these items pose many of the same challenges that other traditional plastic products in the environment pose. So the entangling nature of masks and the elastic bands that are on those masks certainly are an entanglement threat. And just plastics in general, as they are in the waterways, as they are out in the ocean over time, they do fragment, they do turn into smaller and smaller fragments and fibers, which can then be taken up by a diverse array of the marine food chain, including many of the species of fish and shellfish that humans ingest for consumption. We know at the global level that pathway of contamination is quite determined. And so data suggests that we are going to see an increase in this form of plastic pollution as consumption of PPE increases over the coming years. But I think it's really important to distinguish between PPE and the broader issue of just what is being consumed and what is being disposed of with respect to plastics and then plastic pollution. Yes, as I said, PPE is an increased portion of the waste stream. We're generating more waste from it. But again, that is delivering a very, very valuable service. Yes, in many places we can use reusable masks, and we would encourage everyone to do that when appropriate. But again, PPE is a responsible and needed use of plastics. What has also increased during the pandemic, and again, is just exacerbating an issue that has been around for decades, is the consumption of single-use disposable, really the focus of today's conversation. And what we have seen since the start of the pandemic with increased delivery services, increased takeout, is an increase in many of the disposable products that you see on the screen here. And these are not new issues. This is unfortunately a very long-standing issue that has been plaguing waterways, beaches, communities around the world. But the pandemic really has underscored the severity of this issue and is going to increase this issue in the near term. Just to put a finer point, these are not new products that are being consumed and disposed of. These are the same items, again, back to that International Coastal Cleanup data. These are the same items we find in the millions every single year on beaches and waterways around the world in just a single day effort. So millions of these takeaway containers, bottles, bags that have been littering beaches and waterways for decades are the same products that are being consumed at an accelerated rate as a result of the pandemic. So I think it's important to, again, distinguish when we are talking about plastics in the pandemic between that fine line of what is a good and appropriate use of plastics and the value they derive, like PPE in delivering first responders, frontline workers, medical workers, that protection, and then also reevaluating, okay, what fractions of the plastics packaging world, of the disposable plastics world, do we really need to narrow down and think about those aggressive policies that can phase them out, manage them, and push for better recycling? Because as Martin said at the top, this issue is not new. This is an issue that has been around for decades. And we know from science that colleagues and I published just several months ago, a consortium of scientists from around the world, that even with all of the current reduction commitments that have been pledged by corporations, by governments and individuals around the world, based on consumption, based on production growth, over the next 10 years, we are still looking at a cargo ship's worth of plastics entering our aquatic environments every single day by 2030. And so the pandemic is really putting a finer point and a spotlight on this issue in many ways, but this trajectory and this issue is one that has lingered for years and is really hitting ahead and coming to a bottleneck where we need to put in place overhauling comprehensive policies that are going to address this issue at every point in the plastic pollution pipeline. And when we think about where responsibility rests, again, Martin at the top had referenced some of that science that talked about this being an Asian issue. And what we also know is that is not the case. And it is true that in many places around the world where waste collection and recycling does not exist, we do see large amounts of plastics entering aquatic environments. But where does that really start? Where does responsibility start? And new research published just a few weeks ago by Dr. Kara Lavender-Law, I was fortunate to be an author along with some of my colleagues on this work, really highlighted the renewed role of the United States in addressing the issue of plastic pollution globally. So when we factor in those export numbers, the fact that for decades we have been sending the majority of our plastic waste overseas, and combining that with litter and illegal dumping here in the United States actually moves very quickly up the list to as high as third in terms of largest contributors of ocean plastics globally. So again, while we're talking about the pandemic today and the single-use plastics in the time of the pandemic, we can't overlook the systemic issue of plastic pollution and the role of the United States, not just in supporting waste efforts around the world, but really reevaluating its plastic footprint here at home and thinking about the overhauling policies we need to get a handle on the issue to not only reduce our footprint here, but now from this research, we know that by reducing our footprint here, we are also reducing the burden on many, many developing economies around the world. So lastly, what can we do? I think there's a lot here, and my colleagues have shared a lot of the political landscape that I look forward to delving into in the Q&A, but also we do all have a role. I think one thing that I have found encouraging to a certain extent is, in the early days of the pandemic, we certainly saw this run to pause plastic bag bans and to put in place policies that might send us down a pathway towards increased single-use plastics in perpetuity. But what I think we saw after several months of that initial shock factor is this renewed focus on the issue of disposable plastics globally. We're seeing news stories covering this issue every day. We're seeing renewed political conversations and policy conversations at the state and federal level. Nicole referenced the New Jersey legislation, the strongest legislation in the country banning the most problematic and unnecessary single-use plastics. California putting in place those aggressive recycled content standards that are going to pull those materials through the market. And yes, at the federal level, really trying to hone in on things like the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act and other policies that phase out the unnecessary materials and put in place the structures to manage the remainder of the waste stream. So I think we are actually in a point from the pandemic where we have seen a spotlight on this issue, perhaps even finer than it was previously. And we are at that bottleneck again where policies are going to move. And I think we are at the point where the world has really said that this irresponsible, unnecessary use of plastics needs to stop. And we need to just focus on managing the responsible use of this material and deriving the value from it in many of the ways we know exist. So as individuals, over the last year, Ocean Conservancy obviously has been looking at its programs. Our International Coastal Cleanup looks very different this year for obvious reasons. We were encouraging everyone to go out and clean on in a variety of ways, whether that is as an individual wearing personal protective equipment, reusable masks, and going out and doing your small part to clean up where safe. That is the reason we are able to have those data on personal protective equipment and begin to think about what this means for the environment and the ocean. But then more broadly, taking time at home to clean on. So reevaluating our individual waste footprints within our house, thinking about what changes we can make in our daily lives to reduce that disposable plastics use, recognizing that each of those individual actions really rolls up to kind of global collective impact. And then finally, all of us using our voice. We do know there are more and more policies being presented. So reaching out to your local elected officials, reaching out to your respective congressional representatives and encouraging them to prioritize taking policy on the issue of plastic waste and packaging so that we reduce the burden on communities and the environment around the world. So with that, I thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. Really look forward to getting into the Q&A session with my esteemed colleagues. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Rachel.
Thank you, Nick. And let me just, where is, oh, hold on a second here. Where is, all right, hold on. You'd think that I have not worked remotely. Here it is for the last 9 months. Okay, can you guys all see my screen? Hold on. Okay.
Looks good, Rachel.
Okay, good. All right. Yeah, I'm working from my office. I don't typically work from here, so it's trying to get used to the setup here. All right, so thanks for having me on this panel. I really appreciate the invite. I think this is a really important issue. It's a timely issue, and it's only going to grow in the coming future, especially with the new administration. But my name is Rachel Meidel. I work at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and our programs cover domestic and foreign policy issues on a wide array of different issues. And for me, my issue areas are pretty broad. I cover a lot of hazardous waste management issues, issues relating to international policy and law and trade. I do life cycle management work of different things, but I'm very much interested in the work of plastics and some of the advanced technologies that we are seeing today. So I want to come at this from a fairly high level here and talk about sustainability, because I think this is the backbone to, to what our policies are founded upon and where we need to be if we want to get to a circular economy, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But I want to elucidate on what this is and what it means. The whole idea really is about systems level thinking. And most people define sustainability as having this environmental focus solely, or preserving future generations and attaining this homeostasis within the environment. That is a part of it, but it's really more complex than that. It is really about this equilibrium between all of these factors that you see here. It's a systems level philosophy, and it includes all of the social aspects and the economic aspects, and included in all of this, there's subdomains in this, like geopolitics and cultural and tech, socio-technical and so on. And so it's an assessment and an equilibrium of all of these things that really is sustainability. And it has to be assessed from a life cycle perspective. And I think that's really important when we talk about policy solutions and things that really do have a lasting effect, and looking at what are the impacts from the point of generation to final disposal and end of life management. So it's about quantifying and understanding what the risks are across the life cycle, what the trade-offs and unintended consequences are. And as our economy globalizes and we have this rising middle class across the world and over a billion emerging markets out there, it's really important to account for all of these aspects. So the pandemic impacts are extensive, as the other panelists have mentioned, and we're still really trying to understand what it means and how it's going to play out, in the next coming decades or longer. But what we do know that it has tested our resiliency and highlighted our lack of preparation and adaptability. And in doing so, it has exposed vulnerabilities in our system. It's revealed a number of shortfalls in our domestic production of critical goods. It has uncovered reliance on offshore supply chains and accentuated our dependence on foreign markets for end-of-life management of waste. And because of our long-term reliance on foreign markets, we really lost the incentive to innovate better, more practical, higher quality solutions for things like plastics. And COVID, I think, the pandemic and also with China's import ban on a lot of the plastics and materials that were being exported and imported into China also, I think, raised the stakes for sustainability. And it's kind of become a dress rehearsal for the whole agenda, forcing companies and governments to see just how they can tackle an expanding array of challenges. So even prior to COVID, there were existing obstacles that were barriers to waste and recycling, and all the signs were there, and we could really see them, and facing the instability. And the pandemic was just another reminder of how complex and entangled our supply chains are. We've been operating off of linear business models that centered around export and decades of dependence on offshore supply chains and markets for critical materials and end-of-life management of these products. And there's been turbulent commodity markets, and the low cost of oil and natural gas really makes the cost of virgin materials much cheaper to produce. So it's hard for recyclers to compete. There's been subsidies for virgin materials and cheap landfill rates and so forth. And this creates a market that manufacturers really can't compete, and they favor virgin materials. And meanwhile, we've had increasing waste volumes year to year, about 4 to 5% increase. And then also funding for public works and sanitation and waste management are not keeping pace with the generation rates of waste. We have domestic recycling technologies and infrastructure that are only making modest improvements to the developments that are needed to manage the overflow of waste. And we have high levels of contamination and complexity of polymers that make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to manage these wastes at the end of the life. And then, of course, I mentioned China's restrictions that were absolute burdensome for many businesses, around the world. But now that we're in this global pandemic, it is really exacerbating the waste crisis, and it's pushing our decades-long business models of exports and other strategies, and our consumer behaviors of wish cycling and assuming that our recycling materials are actually being recycled at the end of the life. It's really pushing these deficiencies up to the forefront. And so I mentioned our current business models operate off of a linear economy where we take materials, we make them, we use them, and then we dispose of them. But this model is no longer fit for purpose and is now being challenged given consumer preferences and a greater focus on sustainability. So we'll likely see, as I mentioned, a greater push for this in the incoming administration, with a focus on the clean energy revolution and environmental justice. And when we talk about sustainability, it's really become wildly popular to discuss it in terms of a circular economy. And this is what we're trying to gravitate towards, where we can take plastics, where we re-engineer the polymers at the end of the life, and then we reinsert them back into the economy for second, third, and ideally an infinite life. And this whole framework it's restorative and it's regenerative, and it's designed to eliminate waste through the superior design of materials, and it builds end-of-life thinking into upfront R&D and innovation. And it's certainly not a perfect model. There's a lot of different interpretations around the world on what a circular economy is. But it is a great framework to begin thinking about how we can become more sustainable and how to tackle the ever-increasing issues of waste in our environment. So by now, we're all familiar with these plastic statistics on generation and how waste is managed at the end of the life, very low recycling rates and high landfill rates and so on in the US and abroad. Nick mentioned the new figures that were recently published several weeks ago. And so, I mean, these figures are really sobering, and we really need to approach this pandemic with renewed interest and resiliency and an opportunity to build more robust supply chains and reshoring a lot of our operations and investing into domestic infrastructure and waste management here domestically. And while this whole crisis has exposed weaknesses in all of our existing operations, especially in the recycling and waste management front, I think it opens up the door for a lot of investment opportunities for innovative re-engineering and advanced recycling for companies to create redundancies in their supply chains, to minimize their supply chains and become more transparent and socially and environmentally conscious. Okay, so this here is world trade flows of waste, pairings, and scrap plastics here. And when we talk about transitioning to a more resource efficient and circular future, it has broad linkages to international trade. And this is a time-lapse visualization, and it's from 1998 to 2018. And I show this slide really just to demonstrate the interconnectedness of our global economy. Our supply chains are inextricably linked. And, which is why decisions at the local level and the regional levels also have to keep in mind what's happening globally. Again, that systems level thinking. And the pandemic has illustrated just how intertwined and enmeshed we are. And if we want a more circular and sustainable future, we have to be cognizant of the bigger picture. And the depth and the breadth of this current global crisis is a reminder to us that, that we need transformational change if we want to meet the global climate targets and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And if we want to reduce the amount of plastic waste that's entering into our environments, that we have to understand that there are global solutions. We have to look at this globally, but also to keep in mind that it has to be tailored to local and regional conditions. So yeah, that was my last slide. So let me stop sharing here and we can get into the Q&A session.
I want to thank all the panelists. Really great presentations and so much information compacted into such a brief amount of time. We've got a number of really great questions queuing up here in the Q&A box. And I think we've covered a couple of them in presentation already. So if we don't, if we've already covered it, I won't touch on it again. But just sort of following up on the circular economy discussion, this is a major shift in thinking in the way that we approach not only waste and disposal, but production, and linking those two and sort of taking that linear model and reconnecting it. The critique of it has been, this in the simplistic perspective, looking at it, what it can sort of lowest common denominator turn into is let's recycle everything. And as a recycler, we know that that's just not realistic or true. And there's been so many years of education by major brands and by the Chemistry Council and by others saying that all plastic is recyclable, and we know, in fact, that's certainly not true for a number of reasons. So I just wanted to pose back to the panelists and see what your thoughts are on, this is a major shift, and I'm seeing it not just in sort of the philosophical or academic or environmental spaces, but I'm seeing it discussed seriously in government, discussed seriously in the plastic pact and in the corporate sector. And I'm curious, as a ground shift from linear to circular, and that really getting some traction, what do you see as the impacts or potential for that, as we move through, with PPE being very linear right now? How do you see that shift, fundamental shift playing out in the coming years?
I guess, Martin, I can start off on that one, since I brought up the issue of circular economy. But I think this is something that's been gaining traction for many years. Since the late 1970s, we've been talking about circular economy and sustainability even longer than that. Some of the issues with this is that circular economy, there's no one definition for what it is and how it's implemented. If you look at different countries, there's different motivations and origins and prioritization. Germany is really focused on resource efficiency and a top-down materials management strategy. And China was initially focused on end of pipe and waste management, which is what I see the most. It's from a waste management perspective, and not so much from an innovation in materials and business models like we see in the Netherlands. But I love the framework for a circular economy because theoretically I think it can take us where we need to go, where we can reduce our stressors on primary production and make a dent in the waste crisis issue. But but, you know, I mean, I might hold a minority opinion on this one, but I think some of the things we have to be careful with is that, you know, it's not a one size fits all, you know, framework, and there's a lot of tailoring that kind of has to be done. And, you know, when you increase the efficiency in production for things, sometimes you have to be mindful that you're not offsetting some of the environmental gains, and that you balance that with the economics and the social aspects. And I think on the social aspects of that, it's, you know, one of the challenges is you know, are we being OECD centric by expecting developing economies to align with the same consumption cycles and the zero waste and the circular economy principles of the Western world? You know, I think that perspective is diametrically opposed in developing economies who are focused on sustaining their basic needs. So they're not really yet receptive to that whole rhetoric on waste reduction, prevention, and elimination. So I think we have to really be careful of that and understand that not all solutions that we see as solutions in OECD countries, you know, that they're not all transferable to other nations, because, you know, developing nations, I mean, they want their chance to consume, and they have their own consumer preferences, and I think we have to understand that. So in devising solutions, I think it's important for us to recognize the role of the role of like the informal sector, for example, and find a way for them to generate social and economic benefits for their local communities, and also being mindful of protecting their right to economic prosperity, because there is a place for the informal sector in the world of a circular economy. I mean, there's over 11 million people working in the informal sector, and in a lot of countries, they're doing a great job in managing, collecting and managing the waste better than some other countries around the world.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that international perspective in, and you know, the differences between economies, a circular economy in one place, totally different in another. In many developing nations, as you mentioned, the informal sector is doing what waste management systems looked like prior to World War II in the US, and going, you know, back many years, where you had people coming through neighborhoods and collecting things of value. And, you know, glass jars would never just be crushed and turned into asphalt. They would be used many times over. And there were people coming through and getting old rags, and those went into various different industries, including paper industry. So, you know, there were people who came through for bones even, and
Yeah.
Food for animals, and, you know, circular economies in rural areas. And I just wanted to kind of, you know, with regards to PPE, you know, the circular economy is also about how big is the circle, and you know, as a recycler, we're not just trying to recycle 100% of everything. That, you know, is a fool's errand and folly. So how do we shrink that cycle so that we get the benefit from a robust and dynamic economy that supports people in the ways that you're talking about, both in developed nations and in developing nations, without causing all of that, you know, all of the harm that we've learned through the 20th century in developed nations? Are there ways that we can leapfrog some of that and maybe pull back older things around reuse or reduction in production? So, you know, I wanted to hear a little bit about, you know, do you see any hope for that with PPE, and pose that to our other panelists?
Yeah, I'll look to others to speak specifically to PPE. I just wanted to, the one thing that Rachel said I wanted to pick up on, I do think it's also important that we're, with respect to imposing kind of developed economy zero waste strategies, I think it's really easy to think about it as binary, but I would also say there's a lot of places around the world in developing economies where they are far ahead of the United States and other developed economies in putting in place zero waste strategies, right? And it's not that they're consuming less, they've just been pretty thoughtful about the systems they put into place so that they can extract the value at every point of the waste stream and eliminate those problematic products. So and I know there was no malintent there, Rachel. I think sometimes it's easy to think of it as a binary issue, but in many places around the world, developing economies, they are actually far ahead many developed economies in terms of innovative zero waste and other strategies. So just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Oh yeah, no, oh my God, I 100% agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially like when you look at things like with e-waste and textiles and other things, I mean, they are far better. A lot of countries are far better at reuse and creating their own secondhand economies than we are in the United States. And on the point about plastics, going back to plastics and looking at developing economies and emerging markets, in 2016, the informal waste sector collected over 27 million metric tons of plastic waste, and so that prevented that from going to landfills and eventually the ocean. And so that means that more than half of all the plastic material collected for recycling globally is carried out by the informal sector, and that's or almost 60%. And so I totally agree with you. But yeah, my point is that we have a tendency in OECD economies to assume that we're going to take the lead and create this overarching framework, but that necessarily doesn't play out in practical reality, and it shouldn't.
To shift a little bit to policy, because there's so much on the table now, and just the distinction at the macro level between voluntary goal setting and the announcements that some of the major brands have made, particularly the bottlers, through the global audit of material being collected at shoreline cleanups. It's clear that the bottlers are the worst culprits, at least on the shoreline. And important to know that PET bottles, the clear plastic bottles, many of them sink. And so if they don't have their lid on them or some air on them, inside them, they're going to the bottom of the ocean. We haven't even seen the full scope of that problem yet. But just, we've got bottlers making major commitments, joining things like the Plastic Pact. Yet as a recycler, we heard this 30 years ago when California went from a refillable bottle system to a much more linear recycling system through our deposit program and bottle deposit program in California. And so just wanted to ask Nicole, what do you think about this mandatory minimum content approach or mandatory bottle deposit systems that the bottlers have fought across the nation? Really only 10 states being successful in getting deposit systems. And they're the only system we know about that actually captures the bottles back. And yet you've got, on the voluntary side, they're saying, yeah, we want to get all this stuff back and be 100% recyclable. And then they go and fight bottle bills, which are the only ways that seem reasonable to expect that we're going to capture those things. So just wanted to see, what your thoughts were in the broader scheme of mandatory, voluntary, can industry lead? Do we need regulations? Is minimum content and deposit systems, are they both necessary? One or the other? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that goes hand in hand with something that Rachel was talking a little bit about, which is the markets for virgin material versus recycled material, and the fact that it's just a lot cheaper to buy virgin materials at this point than it is to buy recycled materials. So I do think that the mandatory recycled content laws can provide really a needed regulatory push to require industry to buy recycled materials to stabilize that demand a little bit, because otherwise I think that's really the most direct way to affect those market forces. And I'm not sure that it'll be accomplished otherwise. As you say, there's a lot of talk out there from groups about voluntary initiatives, but whether or not those actually translate to action as far as buying recycled material is another story. So I think those mandates are something that can push the market in that direction. The bottle bill also, I think, could be effective. As you say, that is one of the only ways that's been proven to actually get these materials back into the recycle stream. And as I mentioned, it would provide a little bit more stability and clarity for manufacturers. Currently, manufacturers are trying to comply with 10 different bottle bills. Of course, they want to sell their products throughout the whole United States, and all these laws apply a little bit differently as far as labeling and the requirements. So that can be a challenge to comply with. So it could actually simplify things for manufacturers to comply with a national law, as well as increase overall recycling rates for those products.
Great, thanks for that perspective. There's a question here around chemical recycling and so-called advanced recycling. From our perspective, as a mechanical recycling, for those who aren't following this, chemical recycling is the idea of taking collected plastics and then putting them through various and sundry different chemical processes to try and capture or recreate the original resin. And in the manufacturing process, there's tons of additives and sometimes multiple different types of plastics and or other materials that get combined into the packaging. So the idea is to try and extract back out those resins in a form that is identical to the original virgin fossil fuel-based plastics. From our perspective as mechanical recyclers, where we're just collecting that stuff and then it basically gets washed, chipped, and melted, and then reused in its sort of altered state. A lot of these advanced, so-called advanced processes have been around for decades, and there's nothing new about them, and they haven't penciled out in the past. And there are some real dangers with them in terms of them going, the easiest thing to do with them is to turn them into very low grade and polluting fuels. And so there's this plastic to energy and plastics to roads. And then, at the highest end of that spectrum, you can get, more circularity, where if you've got, say, a green plastic bottle, you could actually get the dyes out of that and have clear again. And that would be great, but it's very expensive and hasn't really throughout the decades come to scale. So there's a lot of talk about it now. And yet, as recyclers who've been around a long time, we've seen a lot of things come and go. We've heard this whole chemical recycling spiel in the past. And so we don't have a lot of confidence that it's actually going to result in a significant or fundamental change. And it brings with it some real risks of sort of false narratives about, oh yeah, it's going to solve everything, and we're back into rainbows and unicorns and recycling. And it could also actually create harm in terms of going into some real polluting technologies or having some real nasty side effects. And I'm just wondering what the panelists think about chemical recycling, the new focus and attention on it. Do you think it will pan out? What are your hopes and concerns?
I guess I could start off on that one. I guess we'll just, there's a lot to learn and understand yet with chemical recycling, and there's a lot of different technologies with that, pyrolysis and gasification and hydrolysis, methanolysis, and so on. But what we do know is that even with investments in advanced robotics and enhanced optic recognition technologies and AI to improve our conventional mechanical processes, there's just fundamental limitations that inhibit the traditional system from recovering all of the polymer families that are out there, and especially with all the additives and things. I mean, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on standardization of polymers to kind of prevent that from happening in the first place. But we have, you know, over 400 million tons of plastic annually that we generate globally. And as I mentioned, with a 4 to 5% increase every year. And so our conventional processes aren't equipped to manage all of those. And so I think, you know, one benefit of chemical recycling is that it has very little degradation. It produces virgin grade materials, you know, that maintain its quality and value without the downcycling that may occur with traditional mechanical recycling. And, you know, when quality degrades via downcycling, that means that most of that plastic will eventually end up in a landfill or incinerated. But I think, you know, all recycling methods have a role to play in reducing plastic waste in the future and achieving some of the sustainability goals that we're trying to go after. But, you know, I think we need more investments in general in waste recovery and definitely in advanced recycling frameworks and technologies to deal with you know, all of the waste that we can't manage right now. And as Martin, you mentioned, chemical recycling, it hasn't been around, or I mean, it has been around for a really long time to turn plastics into fuel. But what is new is this growing market and demand for high quality plastic recyclates. And that is due to higher targets for recycling plastic and packaging products, and a heightened sense of corporate responsibility. And now, you know, the China's import ban and COVID. You know, that said, I do understand the public and policymakers' concerns regarding chemical recycling. You know, emerging technologies in this sense are not well understood by regulators, the public, and decision makers. I think there needs to be common language around you know, what chemical recycling is that differentiates it from waste to energy and plastics to fuel, because that's really not what it is from a technical and scientific standpoint. I think there are fundamental elements of advanced recycling that we need to understand and communicate for successful uptake. I mean, we need to understand what the risks are from an environmental, economic, and social standpoints, and where are those risks, and how do we lower those risks to drive investments, and so there's a whole host of things that we really need to understand, and I understand the concerns that we want to avoid waste to fuel lock-ins. You know, the EU recently put legislation into place that looked at advanced chemical recycling and inserted it into their legislation, but it only recycled is only if it's not subject to energy recovery, and you know, it has to be reprocessed into new materials, and it can't be used as fuel. So I think there's pathways that we can tailor and pursue this. But, you know, as with any technology, it's important to understand their technological and economic availability to retain value within current and future markets. And we really have to understand what all those trade-offs are. And I do want to mention that Chevron Phillips Chemical recently created the first commercial scale production of polyethylene using advanced recycling technology. And it's the first commercial scale production. And so this is a significant achievement in creating circular polymers, but I think fundamentally with all the various forms of advanced chemical recycling, there is a lot to understand, and we do need investments to look at that in order to scale it and understand where all the risks and trade-offs are.
Great. Nicole, I'd love to hear your perspectives on this, and particularly, you know, with the amount of investment that's needed for that, who should pay? I know this issue's come up a lot, and it's in the questions here about, you know, is this something that taxpayers and the government should pay for? I know it's been suggested as included funding through the Recycle Act and other national legislation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Rachel says, that it's something that does deserve more investment in order to more fully understand the implications of advanced recycling. I think that since there is increasing focus on plastic pollution and plastic issues, now could be a time when national legislation that includes money dedicated to investigating these new technologies could be something that would have national support. And I think one of the most important aspects of the advanced recycling issue that we've mentioned is to really fully understand what are going to be the other consequences as far as what other environmental impacts there are going to be. You know, what other, we know that in every chemical and industrial process, there are going to be all kinds of environmental impacts other than just the primary product that's being produced. And we need to really understand what's the full picture of advanced recycling. I think it's something that deserves to be studied. I think it could be a great opportunity, but we just need to understand the full picture and, you know, and how that's going to be regulated, how that's going to be addressed going forward to make sure that it's a net positive and that we're not taking 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back as far as the environmental impacts. So I think probably the most likely scenario is kind of a combination of government investment and investment from the private sector to get that moving forward. I'm hopeful that it's something that will turn out to be a useful part of the overall solution to addressing the plastics issue. I think it's important not to pin all our hopes on one thing. I think it's probably going to be a combination of all these different strategies that's going to work together the best.
Yeah, going back some years and, you know, thinking about the origins of this movement and recycling as an industry, or modern recycling as an industry, I think back to the Keep America Beautiful campaign, the so-called Crying Indian ad that people of my generation certainly remember as being formative. And it was focused on the individual responsibility of getting, you know, of being litter bugs and dumping the garbage that the industry has created for us in the natural environment. And, you know, it's something that's still very much discussed of who's responsible for this. Is this something that industry needs to take responsibility for? Is all the trash in our neighborhoods around fast food stores, is that the result of the fast food stores, or is that the result of dirty litter bugs in the neighborhood? And, you know, that debate is still very much at play when we're talking about including hundreds of millions of dollars in some of these federal proposals for technology to try and clean up the mess being put out by manufacturers of disposable products, and, you know, that ending up in our waterways and oceans. And I'm just, you know, from somebody who, an organization that focuses so much on doing those cleanups, and, you know, we do them here in Berkeley, and we have a litter hotspot because of our location in the Bay. And we end up cleaning up not only our own waste as a result, but that from the whole Bay Area and what comes in the Golden Gate. And we do it, you know, 3 times, 4 times a year, over and over and over again. And you just go, you know, at what point is it not our responsibility and somebody else's? And I wanted to pose that to you, Nick, like on the cleanup side, like whose job is this?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Martin. I would agree. Like, cleanup in perpetuity is not the solution. And I think if we actually look at some of the new science that I referenced that has emerged, I do think what that science has shown is that there is no single solution. I think everyone on this panel knows that, most people know that, and that, you know, it has to start with source reduction. If we're actually going to bend the curve and get a handle on this issue, we need to significantly reduce just the sheer amount of disposable plastics that is being produced, upwards of 25 to 40%, depending on economy, right? In the United States, largest producers of plastic waste globally, we really need to get a handle on our reducing that generation. At the same time, management is still a critical piece. We're going to have to make sure that the systems are in place to manage those remaining higher value quality materials that are in the system. A really interesting study was just published this week, I think Greenpeace, right? That looking at recycling companies across the country, really outside of the ones and twos, like nothing can really be recycled widespread across the country. So that is a failure when we think about circular design, that the design of these products are not matching the back ends. And so, you know, I think we have to absolutely look at the front end design as it, you know, does or does not mesh with the back end. And I think also when we think about the chemical recycling angle there, obviously I'm not a technical expert on that, but I do think, you know, when we talk about a really capital intensive technology to deal with that lower value, hard to recycle, you know, disposable material, does that make sense economically and just from a source reduction kind of sustainable circular economy arc? So I think those two pieces, the source reduction, reducing the sheer amount of disposable material that needs to be managed in the first place, ensuring materials that are in the system and delivering those high value utility to society can be managed properly, whether that's through composting, recycling, and just in worst cases, landfill. And then finally, there is going to be a sustained need for cleanup. The science shows that even if we do those other things perfectly, we're still going to need to clean up the remaining, you know, plastics that are finding their way into the environment. And I think when we look at cleanup, it's really twofold. Obviously, the manpower, the volunteer effort that's out there is an extraordinary effort, but it's not the responsibility of citizens alone. And so how do we better institutionalize cleanups? Look at where funds come to make that part of municipal budgets, you know, looking at things like extended producer responsibility and fractions of kind of the private sector covering some of those costs. And then finally, I don't think we can overlook also the role that waterway infrastructure has. So we've seen some really amazing, you know, trash traps and water wheels that do prevent that material from entering the coastal environment, at which point cleanup almost becomes impossible once it's out in the open ocean. And that's not talking about large capital intensive, you know, $1 million water wheels necessarily. In some places that may be fine. Right now, we're fortunate to be working with a partner in Vietnam on a very locally appropriate, low-cost solution that is highly effective at taking plastics out of riverways. So it's a long way to say, Martin, like cleanup's going to be a part of the equation for a long time. It can't just be a once-a-year volunteer effort type cleanup, right? It has to be institutionalized in a certain way, and it has to be a shared responsibility from individuals, government, and the private sector alike in terms of footing the bill for that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that perspective. I wanted to sort of move to the, you know, recycle. The hierarchy is reduce, reuse, recycle, and you talked a little bit about the reduction part of it. And you know, you can have a circular economy that doesn't reduce anything, and you know, just keeps growing. And that is, you know, really what the fossil fuel industry and the petrochemical industry have been working towards. You know, they're really driving plastics as at least a backup plan to reduction in fossil fuel use overall. When you have oil cheaper, you know, in the negatives now, where people for a minute there were getting paid to take it, it's hard to compete with a recycled product that may be contaminated with or blended with other things, and you know, not perform in the same way in the manufacturing process. But we really have to get to that place where, you know, it's reduce first, reuse, and as a last resort, recycling. You know, for us as a recycling or zero waste organization, our goals is, you know, we don't want anything going to landfill. We want a truly circular economy. But for some of these things, like you've mentioned, the 3 through 7s, that the non-bottle plastics that really don't have markets, really don't have any place that we can sell them. You know, we'd much rather have them in a landfill in California, where we know they're where they are, and that they're contained, and that they're being managed well, with you know, the best management practices that we can expect in the current context. But you know, that drives us to, okay, we got to reduce those things, and we got to get rid of that stuff, and that brings us into a reuse space. And somebody asked a question about loop and the scalability of reusables. And here in Berkeley, we've piloted a reusable cup program called Vessel. There's a reusable takeout and delivery service now here in the Bay Area called Dispatch. And just wanted to get your guys' ideas. This is a very emergent space. It could be a reuse economy and service-based economy that really takes off in certain arenas, either geographically in areas where you could get those kind of density or nexuses, or at the national level through through brands really adopting it through programs like Loop. And I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on reuse in the closing minutes here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could comment on that briefly. Yeah, I mean, I think reuse is a part of that whole waste hierarchy. At the top to eliminate, reduce, and reuse. So I think that's a step in the right direction. Anytime we can cut down on primary production, that's a great move. But even if we do reuse, eventually those things are going to have an end of life. And so I think it's important to, going back to circular economy and sustainability, is to go back to R&D and the innovation stage and design for circularity so that we can infinitely reuse something, and not just for a shortened period of time. And along with that, to develop recycling and treatment markets, because the pandemic and years of exporting has really caused an underdevelopment and just the recycling and waste management infrastructure. So I think it's one tool in the overall toolbox on how to get to sustainability in the plastics arena. But I think it's going to come down to also, collection. It doesn't matter what type of technology we use, whether it's chemical recycling or mechanical recycling, and what kind of strategies we take. The fundamental problem is that we have deficiencies in our collection system. So we really need to improve the economics of waste collection, and then work towards reducing problematic and unnecessary single-use plastics. And again, designing for circularity and bringing the consumer into this, and creating educational and outreach strategies to increase some of their knowledge around what recycling is and what circularity is.
Nick or Nicole, you guys have thoughts on reuse and scalability?
Yeah, personally, I love the idea of focusing on reuse. I think, as you say, it's such an important piece of the overall picture. As far as from a legal perspective, this is something I see as being probably more efficiently regulated on a local level or a smaller level, at least as a start, rather than on a national level, because I think these types of programs really should be tailored to the communities, and it would work a lot better if they can be regulated on a smaller level, and kind of fit the needs of the community to the needs of the program, and have needed regulations work in that framework, kind of a pilot program in different communities before moving on to a larger scale. But I love the idea of reuse. That's something that I'm a big proponent of. So I hope that those types of programs take off more. Great.
Well, we're certainly in that space of trying to test it out in the communities where there is some appetite for it. We've got a single-use foodware reduction act here in Berkeley on pause because of the impact on restaurants. We are moving forward with that, but it's not being heavily enforced. And then also piloting some of these reuse programs and seeing, how you can get that kind of nexus of a reduction policy combined with new services in the marketplace. And I think with that, we're out of time. Chandler, I didn't know if you had any closing comments, but I just wanted to thank the panelists. It's been a really great dialogue, and I've learned a lot, and I hope the audience is taking away a lot as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you again to our audience for joining us today and for your many thought-provoking questions. I felt like we had a really great dialogue, and just really appreciate everybody's attentiveness and thoughtful remarks today. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in the years ahead. And one final big outstanding thank you to our panelists. We just really appreciate your many contributions to today's program. Thank you all so much again. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.